Hello, welcome back to the podcast, Dazed and Apologized, where we help you navigate culture's questions with faith and reason. Today, we're going to take up a subject that, at face value, you may think, what's the point, Pastor Scott? It's not really that relevant to me, but our goal is that by the end of the podcast, you'll actually see that it's very relevant and it's very needed for us to understand. And that is the question of science. Hasn't science disproved Christianity? Or if I have science, do I need God? Or can science explain everything? And one of the reasons we wanted to really address this issue on this podcast is because our young people are going off to colleges, and this is what they're being taught. Their professors in science are basically telling them that they need to choose. They need to either pick God and religion, or they need to pick science. But you don't need both. Both are unnecessary. So here's just some statements from leading atheists and scientists. First, Steven Pinker once said, quote, "The findings of science imply that the belief systems of all the world's traditional religions and cultures are factually mistaken." Scientist Peter Atkins said, "Science is so powerful that it shows the ancient traditional ideas of religion are unnecessary." And Richard Dawkins, the famed atheist scientist, once said, quote, "The universe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." Which, by the way, is not a place I want to live. But this is what our young people are being taught in schools and in universities. This is what is being propagated out there by some of the current modern leading scientists. And so I'm not a scientist, and you're probably not either. I guess some of you listening may be a scientist, but most of us probably are not. So we're not going to dive into science today. That's not going to be helpful for us because, like I said, I'm not a scientist. But the key thing I want us to understand is that God and science are not in conflict. No matter what people tell you, no matter what you read, they're actually not in conflict. So let's begin with a basic understanding of science. Now, I say I'm not going to get into the weeds, I'm not going to go deep into science, but science is basically a method of discovery based on observations. Any leading scientist will tell you that. Any science book will tell you that. You have stuff, and you observe it, and then you make a conclusion or a discovery based on something that you observe. So let's say a pot of water. We're going to use a pot of water throughout this whole podcast. But let's say you take a pot of water, you set a flame underneath it, and then you watch what happens. This is a scientific experiment. Well, after a while, once it heats to a certain degree, it begins to boil. Okay, that's an experiment. You conclude, you discover that water boils at a certain temperature. But then you add elements into it to do more scientific experiments. Let's say you add a cup of salt to the water. Then you add the flame to it and you observe, is there any difference? Does it take longer to boil? Is there anything, is the consistency of the water different? Then you repeat the experiment with a cup of sugar. Then you repeat it with oil. And this is the basis of science. You observe things, and then you draw conclusions or discoveries based on observations. So science deals with the physical world, things that are here, things that exist. You observe how they act under certain situations, and then you draw observations. It's like the joke, many of you probably heard it, but a scientist and God are talking, and the scientist says, "God, I can do anything you can do." And then God says, okay. So God picks up some dirt, he blows into it, and he creates a man. And the scientist says, "Oh, that's no problem. I got that." And he bends down to pick up some dirt. And God says, whoa, use your own dirt. It's this idea that science has to begin with something in order to observe it, in order to draw conclusions. So that's one of the first ways that science is different. But that is the fundamental thing that's different. Science deals in the physical world. Religion deals in the metaphysical world, the other physical world, the world that exists outside of the physical world. So religion deals with questions such as, where did I come from? Why do I exist? What is the meaning of my life? What is the purpose of my life? What happens after I die? Issues of right and wrong, morality. These are all issues that science can't answer. So Professor John Lennox is actually, I owe him a debt of gratitude here because I've read a lot of his books, and he's a professor at Oxford, I believe. He's a mathematician and a scientist. He's brilliant, and he has debated some of our leading atheists and scientists on the issues of science disproving Christianity. He likes to explain it like this, and this is a very helpful analogy. He says, let's say you decide that you want to poison your grandmother's tea. He says, well, science would be very helpful there because science can tell you how to boil the pot of water, what happens when you apply flame to it and all of that. Science can tell you when you take your tea bag and you dip it in the tea, how the water permeates it and how the tea then spills out and brews into the water. Science can even tell you the chemical compounds of the poison and what it will do to your grandmother's body once your grandmother drinks the tea with the poison in it, Lennox says. But here's what science cannot answer. Should you poison your grandmother's tea? Is that something you should do or you should not do? Science cannot answer that question or really anything about that question because there could be additional variables that you add. What if your grandmother's sick and she's suffering? Well, then should you poison her tea? A lot of people disagree about that, yes or no. Let's say your child has been kidnapped and they're being held at gunpoint. And they say, if you don't poison your grandmother, I'm going to shoot your child. Well, okay, there's another moral element that's being added to the equation. Science can't touch any of those questions. And so what Lennox attempts to answer here is that science and God are not in conflict. Science deals with creation, God's creation. God created an orderly world, and science helps make sense of that order, of the things that God has made. It helps us understand it in a way that nothing else can. So we love science. Science is great, but it does not conflict in any way with God. Now, when you talk to a scientist about this, or you hear a scientist address this concern, that science is limited. Science doesn't deal with the metaphysical, with these innate questions that humans have. When you talk to a scientist about this, they're going to answer that in two ways. They're going to respond in two ways. The first is they're going to say, oh yeah, science can answer all those questions. It just hasn't done it yet. That is their answer. It just hasn't done it yet. And which is really an absurd, ridiculous answer. That's a intellectually lazy answer at best, but really it's an intellectually dishonest answer at worst. That's like me watching the NBA Finals game and my wife says, man, this trash really stinks. Aren't you going to take it out? And I say, yeah, I'm going to do it. I just haven't done it yet. So it's not very helpful, right? It's not a really good way to answer the question. It's a way of dismissing the problem without really answering the question, which is exactly what atheistic scientists are doing. They know the limitations of science, but rather than admit them, they simply say that science can figure them out. They just haven't done it yet. Now again, that's just ridiculous. Now, I will admit, there are some times in life when we use this logic. We say, well, you just don't understand yet. One day you will. If you're a parent, you know that sometimes you're explaining to your kids why you're so worried about their safety, or why you tuck them into bed every night, or why you make sure the doors are locked before you go to bed, or why you make them wear their seatbelt, and you're trying to explain it to them, and eventually you might just say, one day you'll understand. Well, of course, by one day, you don't mean some indefinite time in the future. You mean 10, 15, 20 years later when they're married and have kids, then they'll understand, right? Or even in the Christian world, we live in the already and the not yet. We've talked about this a lot, not on this podcast, but if you've been around Christian circles, you know that salvation's already happened for us. We've already received eternal life, but yet we're not in heaven yet. It hasn't been fully realized yet. So we live in the already saved, but not yet glorified or fully realized yet. But again, we don't mean some indefinite out there nebulous term. We mean once you die and you get to see Jesus face to face and your faith becomes sight, then you're not in the already not yet anymore. Your faith will be fully realized and you'll be fully glorified. So it's just simply not an intellectually appropriate answer to simply say, science can answer questions, it just hasn't done it yet. The second way that scientists will answer the question or the issue of, hey, science can't answer these metaphysical questions, is to dismiss the questions as foolish. I was watching a debate recently in preparation for this podcast, and I got so mad, I almost threw my iPad across my office because this was a PhD in science. This guy was brilliant. And John Lennox, the guy we're talking about, was actually debating him, and he referenced this whole pot of tea analogy. And an atheist scientist just said, well, science doesn't deal with foolish questions. He said those type of questions, where did I come from? What is the meaning of life? Why do I exist? What happens after I die? He said those are foolish questions. They're dumb. They're not worthy of our response. What a cop-out. I could not believe that this academically gifted and achieved and accomplished person would just dismiss the questions as foolish. Because here's the reality, whether you think they're foolish or not, probably almost every human being that has ever lived has had these questions. Why do I exist? What is the purpose of my life? What happens after I die? These are good questions. These are natural questions. These are questions that people have. Like, he's not living in reality. People need an answer to those questions. And he knows that science can't provide them. And rather than admit that science can provide them, rather than admit you need religion, right? You need a God, a creator that answers those questions for you. He just says they're foolish and dismisses them. Boy, if we could do that with everything in life, it'd be easy, right? Okay, so now we're going to move on to how to have a conversation with people, right? What do we need to do when we're talking to someone? Now, I'll admit, this may not be something that happens a lot, but I still want you to be able to think through, you're having a conversation with someone and they ask you about science disproving Christianity. I think, like we did in a previous podcast, you need to ask them what they mean. Let them explain. You need to be a good listener, ask good questions. So say, what do you mean by that? Like, can you give me some examples? Or how has science disproved Christianity? And give them a chance to talk. Give them a chance to explain themselves. Perhaps they haven't really thought it through. It's just been something they've heard. Or perhaps they have thought it through and they have an intelligent answer for you. But if they say that science and God are in conflict, or science and God are enemies and they have no place together, you need to gently and lovingly explain to them that that's just simply not true. Most of our influential scientists from history were believers in God. Now, not all of them were evangelical Reformed Christians, but they were theists. They understood the necessity they understood how belief in a God, a creator God, actually helped the study of science. It aided the study of science. So, two Franciscan friars, which are men belonging to a religious order, Roger Bacon and William of Ockham in the 13th century, who were responsible for the scientific method, were religious. They believed in God. Robert Boyle, who Boyle's Law is named after, was a devout Christian, an evangelist, and a Bible translator. He actually wanted to go into ministry, but he decided he could serve God better as a scientist. But the list goes on and on. Nikola Tesla, Michael Faraday, Sir Isaac Newton, Johannes Kepler, Werner Heisenberg, who was the creator of quantum physics. All these folks were theists. They believed in a God, and many of them were Christians who believed in the God of the Bible. So this idea that God and science don't go together is just a false dichotomy, which means it's a false dilemma. They don't conflict. So if you're talking to somebody, just explain that to them. Just say, hey, actually, history proves that many of our influential scientists were actually believers in God. So ask them, how do you explain that? These are people that are responsible for most of our scientific understandings today, and they were aided by a belief in God. So again, turn it back on them. And then I think a second thing you can do is use some of these Analogies that you've heard in this podcast, the one about the pot of tea by John Lennox, I think is just brilliant because it explains the science is good and science is helpful, but it can't answer every question. Or he even talks about a simpler way to think about it. Let's say I walk into your house and there's a pot of tea boiling, and I ask you, hey, why is that tea boiling? Why is the water boiling? Well, you could answer scientifically. You could say, well, there's flame added to 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen, that heated it to a certain degree or certain temperature to where the agitation of molecule, you could go into a scientific answer, or you could simply say, because I want a cup of tea. One is science, and one is a moral agent who makes a decision to boil a pot of water in order to make a cup of tea. Those aren't in conflict. One is not right, and one is not wrong. They actually mutually benefit each other, and they go together. So I have used those illustrations dozens of times in conversations, and I have found them to be very helpful. So I think if you're in a conversation, listen to someone, ask them good questions, gently and lovingly tell them that what they believe, they're just parroting that from people, because science and God actually are not in conflict. I think a lot of modern scientists have made them in conflict. And then use these illustrations to help them see that we love science. We're not anti-science. We need science. God is a God of order. He created the world in order and with structure, and science helps us make sense of that. However, science is limited. It cannot answer the innate questions that we have about the existence of life, and that is where God and His Word provides us the answers, right? We were created in God's image to bring Him glory. We were created and given orders to go make other image bearers, be fruitful and multiply. We were given the Great Commission, Matthew 28. All of these metaphysical issues, the Bible answers. God of the Bible answers them. So I hope as we took a little bit of a dive into the issue of science and religion today, I hope this was helpful. Again, remember, we're just really scratching the surface. There's a ton more information on this, but I hope this was helpful. And don't forget to tune in to next week's podcast. Thank you for listening. God bless.